Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai, and we have a very, very important discussion today on a set of mathematical analysis that we've done that reveals some unfortunate truths about our U.S. voting systems. And specifically, we're going to be reviewing the Michigan voting results in 4 counties. In Michigan, there's around 86 counties, and what was analyzed here was a top 4 counties were analyzed: Oakland County, Macomb County, Kent County, and Wayne County. By the way, all the data we're looking at, there's 2 sets of data: the early voting data, and then the voting data on election day. In some cases, in Kent County and Wayne County, we combine them. Now, there's 2 types of voting at a precinct, and here's an example. So let's say 200 total voters go to a precinct. Okay, so 200 people walk into that precinct. Let's say 100 of them decide to vote the straight party method. And let's say the votes happen to be 60 votes for Republican candidates and 40 votes for Democrat candidates. So that would be 60% R, 40% D. So that you could argue that that precinct of voters who chose to do the straight party method, it's an indicator of the demographics at that precinct is probably likely a Republican. The other 100 voters who didn't want to do the straight party voting, they chose to do individual candidates. And in this case, we're looking at, let's say 65 votes went for Trump, and let's say 35 votes went for Biden. When you got to put it all together, you'd have the total vote count. So you'd have 60 votes for people who did straight party would come to Trump. That's at 60. 65 who did for the individual. So 60 plus 65, we have 125. So 62.5% of the votes went to President Trump. And then you have 40 from the votes for the Democrat straight party and 35 for Biden. So that'd be 75, so 37.5. So that's what the news would report, okay? But this is an example to give you an understanding of the straight party voting method and the individual and how they combine. On the x-axis, we're going to have Republican straight party vote percentages, right? And on the y-axis, we're going to have the difference between the percentage of people who voted for Trump in the individual candidates vote minus the people who voted straight Republican percentage vote. Straight party vote, 60% voted Republican. Okay, so that number would be 60%, which you would plot on the x-axis. And let's say for that same precinct, the individual percentage vote count for Trump was 65%. Okay, so what would you do? On the x-axis, you would plot 60. But on the y-axis, we're going to take the 65% minus the 60 to get 5%. Let me repeat that again, and I'll show you through on a graph. So if you look at that number, so on the x-axis, we have the Republican straight party vote. And you can see here in this example, right, 60% is plotted. We go look along the x-axis. And along the y-axis, we're doing this calculation of the percentage of votes Trump got minus the percentage of votes that for the Republican. Now, why are we doing this? Well, if you're a Republican, most Republicans probably voted for Trump, okay? Now, in some precincts like this one, it looks like 5% more people, which could have been Democrats or independents or others, even Republicans, voted more for Trump, because this means Trump actually got 65% minus the 60. So just to be clear, every blue dot is a precinct. So in the normal case, if you look at this, if the center line, the red line, is Republicans, okay, straight line, because the reality is that anyone who voted Republican probably voted for Trump. So if you look at all these precincts, they should hover around 0, right? So for example, any one of these Republican straight party votes, if you looked up and you looked at what the Trump vote was, it should be close to 0. So now let's take a case where maybe Trump, and there's some evidence to this, was actually doing better than people are voting just for Republican candidates. Remember, maybe he was getting more votes from others, okay? In that case, the graph would look like this, right? And this is a situation where Trump is more liked than Republican Party candidates. So if you were just a straight Republican Party candidate, you'd be at 0, but you notice these precinct data saying that, hey, Trump was actually liked more than the straight party, than the general Republican slate that was running, okay? So that's sort of gives you an idea, normal case, and this could be where Trump's liked. Now we're going to go into the data that Phil analyzed. What do you see here? You see something quite profound. By the way, as Benny said, every blue dot is a precinct. And what you're seeing is as you move from left to right, which means the left is low percentage of Republicans. So these communities over here on your left are low percentage of Republicans. And as you move to the right, higher percentage of Republicans demographically. Now, what's fascinating on this graph is common sense would dictate that as you moved across, you shouldn't see it go down. What this is saying is, for example, if you look down here on the bottom right here, this is a community that 80% of, or 75% of the people voted straight party Republican, which means 25% voted Democrat. But Trump is nearly 20% less than the Republican slate candidates, and so on. And more importantly, if you look at this data, it's not scattered. It's a beautiful line. So if you just look at the left part of this, so I'm looking at less than 20%. So these are communities, precincts, where they're less than, you could argue, 20% demographically Republicans. And if you were to draw a line, an average, you see it's around 7%. So in this case, in those communities, even though they're not Republican, could be Black communities, minority communities, working class communities, Trump is more popular than other Republican candidates by about 7%. However, if you look in communities as Republicanism increases, Trump's votes go down. And they don't just go down in a random way. If you draw this beautiful center line, they go down in a very linear way. As precincts have more percentage of Republicans, Trump loses more percentage of votes in a linear fashion. So this is quite fascinating. In fact, it's highly unlikely. So what Phil did, Phil Evans, he did this for every precinct. And he found out when you really bring Trump's votes, what we think the pattern should be around the straight party vote line, you find out about 20,000 votes were taken from Trump and 20,000 votes were given to Biden for a 40,000 Biden lead in the Oakland early voting. Okay, just one county. So that's what you see here. Now, more importantly, if you notice, I've drawn these orange lines. So what you notice is this phenomenon, if you actually look below 20%, Trump was actually getting more votes than Republican candidates, right? All the way up to 20%, you see he was getting close to 7% more votes than his other Republican counterparts. But for some reason, which we'll talk about, right at 20%, it looks like his vote counts start getting linearly reduced. And if you look at this curve, and I've looked at lots of curves, Benny, you've seen a lot of these curves, Phil, right? Any one of us who's in the pattern analysis business, when you see this, it's immediately, if you look at these, you say something's up, okay? This is too structured, right? Too perfect.
Yeah.
What is that, Benny?
Too perfect.
Too perfect, okay? You don't, we in data analysis, pattern analysis, if you're in AI, you look for features like these because it lets you build an algorithm, right? This is easy. So this beautiful curve hits flat and boom, it drops in a nice linear fashion. Now, is it only in Oakland County in early voting? Well, let's look here. Here's election day voting. Right, Phil, this is election day we're looking at. And you see the same thing. Election day, there's around 20,000 votes, 10,000, Trump's votes are reduced by 10,000 and Biden's votes were increased by 10,000 here. But look at this pattern, same thing, it's around 7% and boom. The reason this is important is this is in one time period. So temporally, we're looking at one event before election day, early voting, and this is after early voting. You see the same feature. Now, let's go into a different county. Is this only in Oakland? By the way, Oakland is one of the biggest counties. And by the way, I want to put both of them together. You see that in this, when you add it all up, 60,000 votes increased Biden's lead, right? So a total of 30,000 votes were reduced for Trump and 30,000 votes were increased for Biden. So Biden's margin increased by 60,000 votes. All right, so that's Oakland County. Now let's look at a different county. Again, spatially, we're going to a different place and a different time, early voting, Macomb County. Here there were 28,000 votes. 14,000 were taken from Trump, 14,000 were given to Biden. And what do you see here? Well, in this case, Trump actually does even better. He's almost at, what does that look like? About 12%, Benny? 12%?
12%.
And then here, this kicks in around at 25%.
Yeah.
Okay, but same sort of slope. Okay, so they start eating Trump's votes at this point, but he's doing better in these counties by 12% more than the Republican Party candidates. Okay, he's doing better. Now let's go over here to Macomb County on election day. Okay, same feature you see. In fact, he's doing really good here, up to 22%. Right, Phil? That's what that looks like.
22.
Right, in the election day voting. And then again, it drops precipitously right around here. Okay, but same feature, same algorithm is in place. Now we look at, again, the same thing here. So total, when you look at Macomb County, a total of 16,500 votes were taken away from Trump. By the way, these are minimum, and 16,500 votes were given to Biden. So a total of 33,000 lead. So if you take 33 plus 60, we're up to 93,000 votes between Macomb and Oakland County. Now we want to look at Kent County. And Phil, when you generated this data, I believe you combined both early and election day. So we have all of it together. And here you see nearly 45,000 vote margin for Biden, which means around 22,500 votes were taken from Trump. 22,500 votes were given to Biden. And what you see here is a 45,000 margin. And again, you know, in these communities, which are more Democrat communities, Trump's doing well. And then again, the algorithm kicks in and Trump's votes start getting eaten. And what's fascinating about this is here's a community, which is nearly, if you look at this precinct right here, that's 85% people who came in, voted Republican, and Trump's down there, down by 25%.
You could even make the argument that even if you want to believe that Republicans hated Trump so much, the larger that the population size were, they still wouldn't be able to hate him in such a perfect line.
We do have a fourth county, which is Wayne County, predominantly Democrat. And what you're going to see here is something quite alarming, but also spectacular, is this graph. What do you see here? Isn't this fascinating? Wayne County, in fact, it looks like at least this algorithm was not applied. Maybe they did other stuff, and we're not going to even speculate. We want to take a scientific approach here. But what you see here is, look at this. When you put the Trump line, it looked like Trump was doing 10% better. Now, these are predominantly Detroit. I would say, Benny, would you say predominantly Black communities?
So
Trump is actually doing better. He was actually doing better. And there was some evidence that a lot of the people in the Black community were moving away to Trump. Maybe not to Republican voters, but to Trump. And you see that phenomenon here. So our view is, you know, that this algorithm, what we're talking about here, this algorithm was not applied here. Maybe something else was, we haven't detected it, but it's clear that Trump was doing better among Democrat precincts. So that's the data. So what do the results show? Let's conclude on the results. Well, the algorithm that's there moves Trump votes to Biden. That's what it's doing. And I don't think anyone will argue with it because we've seen Trump votes moving to Biden. The second thing is that as precincts increase with a higher percentage of Republicans, greater percentage of Trump votes are transferred to Biden. So you would think, wow, more people are Republicans in this precinct. You would think Trump would do better. In fact, it seems like going to Republican precincts was his worst nightmare. You lose more. He lost higher percentage of votes, the more Republican precincts they were. Another way to think about this is the more the precinct was Republican, the more percent of Trump votes are transferred to Biden in that precinct. I'll repeat that. The more the precinct was Republican, the more the percent of Trump votes are transferred to Biden. And by case in point, let's just go look back here at Kent County. This very dramatic graph here. So very Republican. This is almost like 90% Republican. Trump got nearly 25% votes lost there, e.g. transferred to Biden. So the slope of the discount to Trump's votes is the same for each county. That's what's more interesting. This is a little bit steeper, but by and large, the slope is pretty much the same, okay? So the slope of that line looks very similar, and that's what we wanted to make here. The slope of the discount to Trump's votes is reasonably, quote unquote, I should put the same for each county. Now, Wayne County, other result, had no algorithm we detected, right? That was just flat. So the algorithm, we believe, is a weighted race allocation method. It's a transfer of a percent of votes from one candidate to another. As we've discussed, the percent is a weighted decimal value. Mitt Romney says, look, Republicans broadly are still Republicans, but there's a percentage of them, you know, across the board who just don't like Trump, right? They just don't like him. Trump lost votes, and that's just the way it is, okay? Well, if that were true, what would you see? You would see this.
Right.
You would see all these precincts deviating from the norm, at some distribution like this. But that's not what we see. What we see is a predictable line, a decline of dislike for Trump with increasing percentage of Republican precincts. We actually see this. We don't see this. If Mitt Romney was right, you would see this. Or if any rational person would write, oh yeah, Trump just pissed off a lot of Republicans everywhere. Well, across all precincts, you'd see this everywhere. But what we see is this. In fact, we see a beautiful line, which you could go back to your Algebra 1 class and write an equation for, y equals mx plus b, and I could draw that line. I could calculate it precisely. So precisely, I could put it into a computer program. So given that this predictable linear decline of dislike increases, it makes no sense, right? This makes no sense unless a computer algorithm was in place to lower Trump's votes as a function of percentage of Republicans in a precinct, in this case, linearly. What we're saying is that beautiful point where it's nice and flat, Trump's actually doing well in non-Republican precincts, and then it's like a switch gets turned on and it goes down linearly. Our position is that could only be done by a computer algorithm in such a precise way over so many precincts. It's not like, because over so many precincts, you'd see some random fluctuations. You don't. You see a nice little line going there. So the bottom line is, this is the probability of this from any mathematical description, you would call it, I'm just going forward again, is unlikely. Again, the questions in the future, are both parties and Democrats aware of the algorithmic process? Is there a coup underway? Who is behind such a coup? Democrats, Republicans, or both? Or did Biden win?